don't forget that, but you wouldn't forget, but other people, don't forget that the patriots, when asked, why are you fighting this revolutionary war? They said, we will not be the slaves of England. They didn't say we won't be the second-class citizens, we won't be the people oppressed by it. They said, we will not be the slaves of England. And so they saw themselves as fighting against slavery. They saw that fight as the American fight. And, you know, taking them at their word, although we realize what that word is worth at some point, what really they were supporting was so much in opposition from the way they were defending their own revolution.
I conceal that it's really by framing it in that fashion, are you diminishing the role of slavery as in America itself?
Well, I hope not, because, you know, I realize how important economically and socially slavery was. I didn't get a chance to say this very quickly in terms of the politics. In the 72 years between the election of George Washington and the election of Abraham Lincoln, 50 of those years he's a slaveholder as president of the United States, and nobody during that period ever wins a second term as president who was not a slaveholder. In terms of the economics of slavery and the cotton that slaves produced represented by the time of the Civil War 80% of the U.S. GNP. We produced 7/8 of the world's cotton. You know, we're like the OPEC of cotton production during that period. And the value of slaves was greater than the combined value of all of America's banks, railroads, and manufacturing put together. So that slavery...
I was missing the rhythm with which you usually do that.
Yes.
All of the manufacturing.
Slavery was right. Yeah. I'll get it up. Slavery, no sideshow in America, is the main event.
Okay. Larry Lawrence.
Larry Lawrence, chairman of the John Brown Society. I'm a descendant of 12 Confederate veterans. I want to ask a question to the panel about slavery and white people. Because I think
we did this last night too.
What slavery did to white people.
And that is, if you look at the those who protested in the pre-revolutionary mobs, most of those pre-revolutionary mobs, like the Stamp Act mob, talking about the Boston Massacre mob, and so on, most of those mobs were interracial mobs. What you start to find is that after there is the emphasis on a classless society, which we never had, but the emphasis on a classless society after the American Constitution, and with the rise of Jackson bringing about the rise of the common man, what we start to find is that race starts to play a more and more important part. And so it makes the interracial cooperation, which had been a fact of life before the American Revolution. Don't forget, the American Revolution was fought with interracial military units. It never happened again to the Korean War. So that changed from a more interracial society in terms of the ability of blacks and whites at the bottom of the economic ladder to come together and form alliances. That became increasingly difficult in the 19th century and leads to the kind of racial divide that we are all familiar with in the 21st century.
Larry Earl Colonial Newsburg, it's so good to see you helping to tell the story, to take the history of slavery from the academy to the people out in the streets. And how is the effectiveness, and what's the next step for that going forward, you think?
Well, this, again, very personal to me. This is me speaking as a man in the street rather than a historian, but I think that this is a very broad church we're looking at, isn't it? And it welcomes all sorts and conditions of people in it. And interestingly enough, on the question of the slave trade, my own view, and slavery itself, is that a lot of creative writers have actually managed to touch on the experience of slavery in ways that historians haven't done. If you think of someone like Toni Morrison, the obvious one in this country, or if you think of Sacred Hunger, from Barry Onslow, both of those authors have actually recreated the kind of sense of place and experience of slavery in a way that historians find very difficult, partly because it's professionally, it's very hard to make the kind of leap into the world of sensibilities, I think, for historians. Some who do it, but this, as I said, this is a broad church that sort of should welcome everyone who has something to say creatively about it.
Absolutely.
I find Robert Hayden's poem Middle Passage called Slavery Yes, sir.
Yeah, quick question for Barbara. Accidental historian, there are some novels that were written back in the 1860s. I'm thinking particularly of Maria Child's novels, Hobomok and Romance of the Republic, that seem to have touched on some of the issues, and I was wondering if you would explore any of those as
I know
preparation.
for example, The President's Daughter takes its title from The President's Daughter takes its title from the 19th century novel. It's actually, I think that 19th century novels have a kind of resonance and have a kind of language, the kind of, you know, biblical language, which is much more effective in dealing with the subject than the kind of relativity of modern prose. And this is what I've tried to do in all my novels. That is, they are really 19th century romances. They are 19th century in their construction and in their language, because I found that that is the language that people, first of all, that people spoke back then, and secondly, it is the language to treat this subject with.
The novel that Greenwell Brown wrote.
I wanted to mention a couple of things. It's very interesting. I think it's dawning on me that historians, as representatives of a discipline, may not have all the tools necessary to deal with these kinds of words. I'm going to make a suggestion, and then I'll validate it. But I think that this subject is so totally emotional, and the words that are being used are so directly tied to the human psyche, that the one discipline that is absent from this discussion is that of the psychiatrist. And I say that, and I'll validate it. When the Jewish community decided that they were going to do the Holocaust Museum, the first thing that they did was to get a grant through the National Institute of Mental Health to have psychiatrists help them with the writing of their programmatic content. And I would think that we really bring in the experts that deal with human psyche and also the psychiatry of what has occurred to all of us as a part of humanity. Otherwise, we'll simply be skirting the real deep and abiding issue.
Okay, responses?
No, I absolutely agree. And
Board of Psychiatry.
You're right. No, I agree, and that's precisely the reason I wanted to put this picture of the slave holder and the slave on the screen, so that we could contemplate the social and emotional gymnastics that it takes for a person to grow up with a surrogate mother that at some point they owned. You know, Jefferson and a slave of his father named Jupiter were born the same year. They grew up together. They were good friends as children. Can you imagine, at some point, he owns his former best friend. His former best friend is owned by his best friend. Now, what kind of psychological and emotional impact does that have on Jefferson and, by extension, a Jeffersonian society? A whole society that is being shaped with these kinds of relationships. We don't know the answer to that question. And if we did start to understand the answer, I think it would go a long way towards helping us understand what race means in today's society and how people in today's society are affected by this institution.
Mark?
Yes, on artists, I would like to say that on the UNESCO's International Scientific Steering Committee, Toni Morrison was a member, and Derek Walcott, the Caribbean poet, was a member, and UNESCO saw very early that there are quite a lot of things that scientists cannot express, that artists can express in a very, much more poignant way. As to the psychiatrist issue, we have seen when we have had these children from all parts of the triangle together, we have seen no, very difficult scenes. Even though we have tried to prepare them, it has been very emotional sometimes. I remember, for instance, in Senegal once, lots of the African children, they had never heard about the indigenous Africans, the trade. And it was very tough. And so quite a few of the teachers have used psychologists in the school, in the educational project.
I'm skeptical of bringing in psychiatrists, but I'll say that. Yeah, up front, and then over here. Next, over here. We need succinct questions. We're running up to lunch.
Mine's succinct, but it was along the lines of the psychiatry point of view. In my own evolution in acknowledging race relations and the subject of slavery in this country, there was a process of grief. And I thought it might be analogous that the national mental health would also be the stages of grief that we talk about in terms of loss, that it could be analogous somewhat to what has happened in the, at least American psyche, from my point of view, of not moving through those stages. So sort of stuck in a denial point before moving on to some moving on stage of it, if that makes any sense.
Frederick Douglass wants to, but knowledge is usually an antidote for that. That's just a thought. Over here.
Quickly, we posters know certainly that Toni Morrison's Beloved has been proclaimed the best novel written in the last 25 years. Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, of course. Many novels, recent decade, written about slavery. Carol Phillips's Cambridge, Robert Chase both your own works on Sally Hemings and on Venus. Then we get this uneasy alliance, so is it, or what we call this alliance between literature and history in this context, because you have The Unknown World by E.P. Jones, also Pulitzer Prize-winning novel that talks about black slave ownership. So speak to that. But before you do, drapetomania, 19th century pseudo-psychiatric term for running away. Slaves who ran away. It's called drapetomania.
Cure was to catch him and beat the devil out of him. That's a direct quote.
Shackles were the cure.
No, what I think is that literature plays a part, especially in the history of slavery, because the history of slavery has been suppressed by the mainstream historians. There was no other way I could write about Sally Hemings except as a novel, because there was no historical basis for me to turn to. I did research for almost 3 years. I dug and I found a few documents and a few things that I could use, but the rest, I had to make that leap of imagination. I had to invent a way of talking about her. I had to invent a language that corresponded, and I think this is what has happened to a lot of black writers who have chosen historical subjects that deal with slavery. That's the way it is. There's no alternative.
Okay, if I can just make one quick point, and that is if we look at what's happened in the writing created English in Britain, some of the most striking examples have come from the offspring of immigrants in Britain. If you think of Carol Phillips as a classic example, Mel Covey here, think of David Davide, think of Zadie Smith, and really the list is endless. Now, whilst they're not always engaged in slavery, this is something that actually suffuses their writing to a degree that is very, very hard to ignore.
Cass Phillips was going to be on a panel here, but he had to go accept some book prize.
I hope he won.
Yeah, I don't know if he has yet or not. Yeah, the man in black jacket was next, right here.
Stephen Smith, State University of New York. Professor Walden, I much appreciate what you're saying about the future of the English curriculum and slavery, because having had an excellent first class British education, including history myself, a subject I never learned about until later adulthood. But what is the man on the streets reaction in Britain, given that we're going to be commemorating in the next few months? How is the popular press, the media, what is the response, basically on the street?
Well, the media and man on the street are very often quite different. You know, the media is actually falling over itself to do something to that. Literally, I've been in the US 10 days. There hasn't been a day when I haven't had 3 or 4 emails from people, BBC and BBC related, asking me to help on programs, all branches of the BBC for 2007. Drama, religion, children's programs, websites, you name it. People involved. The man on the street, well, difficult problem. It ranges really. It ranges from the kind of hostility you'd expect, that kind of rather lumpen, redneck approach, through to a genuine quizzical understanding. You know, saying this is very interesting, but it is a whole range of things. You're not going to get any one response, I think. But progress has been made. And you know, 10 years down the line, once kids are going through, have this as part of their education, people say, well, what was the fuss about?
One interesting, just to sideline of this, I did a program for the BBC looking at the British involvement in the American anti-slavery movement. And they were very interested in the number of African-American former slaves that had come to Britain. You know, we know about Douglas, but there were lots of others who had come to Britain and traveled around the British Isles giving speeches about their own personal experiences in slavery. And apparently that was something that really caught the British imagination, for lots of people apparently contacted the BBC about that show.
Back row at the
I'm Rob Berkeley from the Lehrman Trust in London. And as a British African Caribbean, I kind of recognise those as a triangle on my list. I was wondering whether there's stories that we can link about modern migration patterns and those movements across the world to the legacy of slavery, particularly in Europe, but also in the US.
I didn't quite get
modern migration patterns.
Yeah, so the stories about modern migration and the patterns of movement across the planet, and whether there are links in the legacy of slavery that we can make to those movements now.
Well, I think again the West kind of generic term finds very hard to accept is that the migrations of Africans around the world was really quite staggering. It's not merely that Africans have been deposited in the Americas. You think of Simon Sharma's last book, The Sound of Fibers, was recent book, but there were Africans on board the First Fleet, not large numbers of them, but nonetheless they were there. If you look in the archives in New South Wales, you will find a mention of Africans settling down. Ian Duffield did work years ago on the small scattering of Africans into Australia. And who would imagine some of the early settlers in Australia were actually African? You're looking at displacement of African peoples on a quite extraordinary scale, on a global scale. And Africans crop up everywhere. Let me just illustrate one point. In 1542-46, Henry VIII was trying to recover the wreck of the Mary Rose, sunk in the Solent. We know that it was found by a diver who was called Jacques Francois. Except he wasn't called Jacques Francois, he was called Jacques Francois. Except he wasn't called Jacques Francois because he was from Guinea and he was a slave. And whoever thinks that Mary Rose, now an item that people go to see, Henry VIII's lost flagship, was actually discovered by Africans. This is actually woven into the warp and weft of Western history to a degree that we don't know, the scattering of African peoples.
In the back row, we need to be succinct, lunch is waiting.
Okay. This relates to the Middle Passage monument. One of the most powerful lines from the Amistad movie was when Q said he would go back and talk to his ancestors because he was the reason for their existence. We wanted to ask about the spiritual aspect of this Middle Passage monument, because I think one of the things that we as people of Africa descent have failed to do in keeping with our tradition as African people is to honor our ancestors on a continuing basis. And this also ties back to the psychological piece in terms of healing, that we have not done that we don't frequently embrace this notion as a part of our belief system, honoring our ancestors and the spiritual power that it gives us to change our situation currently. And I just want to know what kind of thinking, if any of that, went into the design. And because I noticed that makes and people can come back and make the contribution. And I thought that was a very powerful way for people of African descent to buy into the notion of honoring their ancestors.
Well, that was part of my speech that got cut. But anyway, I call these, because I'm an abstract sculptor, so that these narrative memorials, these narrative sculptures are something that's almost aside from what I do all the time. And I think that the idea of memory and the idea of memorialization is something that is universal and is absolutely necessary. And because of our experiences here in the States, Black people have suppressed this whole episode. I mean, they've literally suppressed 200 years. And now they have to go back and they have to recuperate this, and they have to grieve, and they have to come together, and there has to be places that they can go to do this. And that's why, you know, these sculptures are important, and that's why Middle Passage sculpture in Washington is important. And it's the language which is universal. It's a visual language, it's like music. You don't have to understand what you're looking at. You don't have to, be an expert in art in order to react emotionally to an object or to a statuary. That's all I can do.
One more, Norman.
That you looked around the room and that the people supporting Lynn Stewart were quite elderly, and I was one of the younger people there.
She's the lawyer who was convicted?
Yes, the civil rights lawyer who was convicted. And he was, Amiri Baraka was bemoaning the fact that there were so few young people involved in these issues, and he made the point that it really was the art and the artist that can engage, well, he was talking about younger people, but we can extrapolate perhaps, that can engage the larger population. And certainly in a discussion of public history, it seems like the artist is making the point of intersection. Now, if I may interject my own experience in the last letter
to that. Things are changing. We are, as a profession, that is, professional historians that teach in the academy, are starting to realize that most people who learn history don't learn it in our classrooms. And if we want them to learn good history, we've got to be out there where history is being taught. And there are more and more people who are becoming interested, and that's why public history is becoming such an important part of the teaching of many academic institutions. Not enough, but we are moving in that direction. But I think that what you're saying is something that more and more academic historians are doing good and participating in.
Just let me say that things change. Please change quickly. I'm 68.
Yes, then I am an anomaly. I am native of the Mississippi Delta, but yet I've spent over 50 years in the heart of the United Nations, either as an employee or as NGO. And I'm sure that the panelists sense my sense of anger, disgust, despair when the U.S. government walked out with its comments of the Durban conference. And I just wonder if any have any contributions to make, how you maintain your equilibrium.
When I first heard of the attack on the World Trade Center, my first thought was Colin Powell should have gone to Durban. I mean, it turns out it wasn't related, but that was my first, I'll never forget it. My first reaction was we should have been in Durban, but anyway.
Equilibrium, well, with great difficulty is the answer, I suppose. And it's not just the United States. I mean, there's all kinds of posturing around Durban on the part of Western nations. I think, and this is again me just as an author, my own feeling about this is that major Western European powers, I don't know the US, but they're really running scared about reparations. They're really running flying flags. Wherever I go, 5 years ago, no one raised the issue in lectures. Now it's raised all the time, in Britain that is. And I think the British government put out a 3-line whip. If ever there's a minister around, reparations, the answer is no, nothing good, nothing good. And they do that because they know that there's a groundswell in favour of discussing it. But the idea that you can simply not engage with it, not even discuss it, have your head in the sand, is an absurdity, quite apart from what your reaction might be. that the West has simply to take on board that this is an issue, it's on the table, and it's not going to go away.